pleasure to be here at this exciting conference. I know that Andreas thinks that I don't understand Spanish and I don't know what he just said about thinking we lost our luggage in our room, but I heard that. The title of my talk today, Future Memory, might strike you as a little strange. After all, that we know that memory is about the past. But I'm going to try to make 3 points in my talk today. Number one, that memory is at least as much about the future as it is about the past, and there's a tight link between remembering the past and imagining the future. Second, I'm going to try to make the point that memory is a constructive process. We heard in Henry Markram's talk 2 days ago that perception is a constructive process. The brain constructs a perception of the outside world. Well, I think the same is true for memory. Third, I'm going to try to convince you that there's a link between the role of memory in imagining the future and the constructive nature of memory. So those are 3 points I hope I can make in the next 19 minutes. First, I want to start with a couple of examples of some striking cases in which people misremember the past that give us clues relevant to the points I'm going to want to make today. The first comes from a tragic recent event in U.S. history that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. This is the Oklahoma City bombing, the terrible bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. And some of you may remember, particularly if you were in the States or following the news back in 1995 when this horrific event occurred, that in the days and weeks after the bombing, the FBI led a nationwide manhunt for 2 men. They were called John Doe number 1 and John Doe number 2. John Doe number 1 turned out to be Timothy McVeigh, the person depicted in my slide here in prison uniform, who was ultimately convicted and executed for his role in carrying out this bombing. John Doe number 2, however, was never found. That's the picture that the FBI circulated in the days and weeks after the bombing. And there was an intensive hunt for John Doe number 2, but no one could ever find anyone involved in the bombing who looked like that guy. But they did turn up somebody who looked exactly like that guy. And the reason why they were looking for him as a suspect in the bombing turns out to turn on someone's mistaken memory. There was a mechanic by the name of Tom Kensinger who was at the body shop where McVeigh rented the van that he used to carry out the bombing. And he had a distinct memory that there were 2 people at the body shop that day, McVeigh and that guy, John Doe number 2. Well, it later came to light that Kensinger had also been at that same body shop the next day, the day after. And that's where he saw that guy with the baseball cap on with someone who looked like McVeigh. And apparently what he did is he mixed up his memory, elements of 2 different memories, and fused them into one and insisted with great confidence that McVeigh rented the van with that guy. But he wasn't there. He was there the next day with somebody else who looked like McVeigh. Here's another example of the same sort of thing, maybe even more extreme. Some of you who have read The 7 Sins of Memory might know this story. Donald Thompson is a memory researcher himself in Australia. He was shocked when he was accused of raping a woman based on her detailed memory of what he looked like. She remembered him so clearly that she led the police to his door. Well, fortunately, he had an airtight alibi. He could not have committed this rape because at the moment this rape happened, he was on television giving a live interview about, of all things, memory and memory distortion. It could not have been him. What happened? The woman who was raped was watching that show when an intruder broke into the house, and the woman who was raped, perhaps in the stress of the rape, confused her memory of Thompson. She really saw him on the TV screen. She thought he was the guy in her house. He wasn't. Well, these kinds of inaccuracies and distortions in memory are not news to psychologists. We've known about them for a long time. And one of the pioneers in our field who really first brought this to light, that memory is prone to errors, it's not an exact replica of the past, is the British psychologist Sir Frederick Bartlett. And I'll read you a quote from his famous 1932 book on remembering. The first notion to get rid of is that memory is primarily or literally reduplicative or reproductive. In a world of constantly changing environment, literal recall is extraordinarily unimportant. Memory appears to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. There's that idea of constructive memory. It's not just a reproduction of a picture inside our brain. Subsequent developments, much research has shown that Bartlett, who was influenced by observations of memory distortions in experiments that he carried out and reported way back in that 1932 book, that he was right, that memory is a constructive process. And when I use that term, what I mean is that when we remember an experience from our past, we're not just bringing up a file like we bring up a file on our computer. We're linking bits and pieces of information from different sources, different elements of an episode that may have actually happened to us. Our general knowledge, our beliefs, our expectation, all that goes into the construction that we call a memory. Well, many of us working in psychology and neuroscience believe this general take on memory, but there's a question that's nagged me for a long time. What are the functions of a constructive memory? If our memory system is set up in such a way that it can give rise to the kinds of errors we just saw in the Oklahoma City bombing case and in the Donald Thompson case, and is documented in many laboratory experiments, what function does this kind of memory serve? Well, one idea is one that I argued for actually in the 7 Sins of Memory, and other people have argued for as well. And I'm going to call that economy of storage. We typically don't need to remember every detail of every experience we've had. Sometimes we're just better off remembering the general gist of what happened. We don't want to record every bit of detail about what a room looks like or exactly what a person says. We don't need all those details in order to recollect our experiences. We want to extract the meaning of the experience, and that's often what human memory does. And you could argue that's a functional adaptive property of the system, and I agree with that. But today I want you to entertain a related but different idea. And that's that the hypothesis I'm going to put forward to you is that one function of a constructive memory is to allow us to imagine the future. Now here I'm talking specifically about episodic memory. That's the kind of memory we use when we think back to our past and we remember personal experiences that we've had. So this is traditionally defined as our ability to recollect past experiences. And I want to argue that episodic memory is not just there to allow us to reminisce about our past experience, is also important for the future. We use our episodic memories to imagine possible future scenarios, to try out different versions of upcoming events. We draw on our past and we simulate what might happen before we actually engage in the behavior. So we can kind of think of memory as serving a simulation function, or the brain as a big simulator. And I want to suggest that this constructive activity requires flexible access to elements of past experience. In other words, you need a memory system that's going to allow you to kind of recombine elements of experiences you've had to imagine different experiences in the future, but I'm going to suggest this could also get us into trouble sometime. Now, to give you a more concrete idea about what I mean when I talk about imagining the future and remembering the past, let's do a very quick experiment. Similar to the kind of experiment I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes that we've done when we put people in a brain scanner, an fMRI scanner, and measured their brain activity. I'm going to give you a word, simple word, and I want you to think back to an experience, a specific experience in your life that this word reminds you of, that happened within the last year, okay? Vacation. I want you to rummage around in your memory and think of a specific personal experience related to vacation. Okay, how many people have come up with a specific memory of a particular vacation, okay? Anybody who hasn't, you come see me after the talk, okay? Very good. Now I want you to do something slightly different. I'm going to give you a different cue. The cue is dog. And I want you to now think forward in time. I want you to imagine an experience involving a dog that could plausibly happen to you within the next few months of the next year. Something that in your upcoming future might happen, a specific episode. Okay? People come up with a specific episode of a future imagined episode involving a dog? Okay, very good. Well, that all seemed very effortless and easy. You can remember your past and imagine your future. I want to tell you about an interesting patient who can do neither one. This is a patient who I studied back when I was at the University of Toronto in the mid-1980s. He's known in the literature as patient KC. Patient KC had a head injury that damaged a few different parts of his brain that are very important for memory. If you do the task that we just did, where we ask KC to come up with a specific memory in response to a word cue or any kind of cue, he can't come up with anything. He can tell you some general facts about his past. He knows where he grew up, he knows his name, things of that nature. He can't remember a specific episode. Here's the interesting point related to today's talk. He also can't imagine future specific episodes. If you ask him to think about what might happen tomorrow and imagine a specific episode, he'll just tell you his mind is a blank. This is someone who has a normal IQ and can carry out many cognitive tasks perfectly normally. He might give you a generic future episode. Well, maybe I'll have breakfast or lunch tomorrow, but he can't come up with specifics in his future the same way he can't come up with specific episodes from his past. It turns out that KC is not alone. And over the last few years, there's research coming out of our lab and other labs around the world where we're seeing striking commonalities in the processes underlying remembering the past and imagining the future. I was going to also mention that KC's damage occurred in a part of the brain that we're going to talk about in a minute later on, known as the hippocampus, which is right in this part of the slide, kind of in the middle of the slide. It's important for establishing and retrieving new memories. He also had damage up in the front part of the frontal lobes. But now let's look at those similarities, commonalities between past and future events. KC is not alone. More recent research has shown that some other amnesic patients who can't remember their past also can't imagine their future. We don't know whether this applies to all amnesics. Some amnesics can imagine the future, but a large number of them cannot. Second, there have been cognitive studies that show some very interesting similarities between past and future events. So, for example, we know that if I ask you to remember a recent an event from your past, that'll be more vivid than if I ask you, on average, to remember an event from childhood. The same thing happens if I ask you to imagine an event in your future. If I ask you to imagine an event next week, that's going to be more vivid and detailed than if I ask you to imagine an event that might occur 10 years from now. A commonality between remembering the past and imagining the future. Related to that, research has shown that people with depression and also just healthy elderly adults tend to remember their past in less detail than control subjects. They have a more sketchy memory, less detail about who, what, when, where. Those are the episodic details. Well, research has shown they have that same problem when they imagine ahead to the future. Their future imaginings, just like their memories of the past, have less detail, less information about who, what, where, and so forth. And then finally, this is an area where my lab has been particularly active. When you put people in the scanner, in the brain scanner, and do the kind of task that we just did for a demonstration, you find that very similar areas of the brain are active when you remember the past and imagine the future. This led Donna Addis, Randy Buckner, and I a couple of years ago to propose that there's a core network, what we called a core network, that is involved both in remembering the past and imagining the future. That includes parts of the frontal lobe, parts of the parietal lobe and precuneus back here. The medial temporal lobe that you see over here is a part of the brain that includes the hippocampus. And as we'll see in a minute, the hippocampus becomes very active both when we remember the past and imagine the future. And there are a couple of regions on the lateral surface of the brain, the lateral temporal cortex, lateral parietal cortex, that show very similar activation. Well, in light of this kind of research, Donna Addis and I went on to propose an idea that tries to link up this work on commonalities between remembering the past and imagining the future with the work we talked about earlier on constructive memory and memory distortion. And this idea is something that we call the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but let me explain it. So constructive is to reflect the notion that we're talking about constructive processes in memory and imagining. Episodic, we're talking about specific events, either in memory or imagination. And simulation is really another word for imagining, that people engage, use their past experience to simulate upcoming events. And there are three critical aspects to this idea. One is, as I've already stated, episodic memory involves constructive processes. So we don't think that there's any one place in the brain that you can go look and find a memory and say, there's the memory. The memory is more distributed. Details of episodes are stored as fragments in different parts of the cortex. And when we remember, the hippocampus and other regions plays an important role in reintegrating those details together. And so we construct that memory of a past event from those disparate details. Number two, we think that, as I mentioned earlier, the constructive nature of episodic memory makes it a good system for allowing you to use your past experience to build simulations of the future. You can extract details from past events and, importantly, recombine them into novel scenarios to imagine ways in which episodes may play out and how you might prepare for those episodes. And then third, though well suited to simulating future events, we think this constructive nature of memory has a cost. Miscombination of details that we talked about earlier that can result from in-memory errors, such as what we saw in the two examples, where you're jumbling up details, you're extracting and recombining details from distinct episodes, but in a way that makes your memory accurate. That's a good thing if you want to simulate the future. It's a bad thing if you want to have an exact memory of the past. So let me just close by showing you some actual results from studies where we put people in the scanner and show you just a couple of interesting results in closing. So the basic paradigm, and this is a cartoon that was made by an artist in an article we wrote in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, that reduces our paradigm to kind of the simplest procedure. It's more or less what we did in our demonstration. We give a cue word like vacation, and then a person is put in the scanner and we measure brain activity while, for example, in this case, the subject is remembering walking on a beach during a vacation. Or we ask them to imagine future events that might happen at different points in time. Here the subject is imagining in response to the cued dog, as we did, picking out a puppy in a pet shop. Okay? And we record brain activity while they're doing these tasks and some other control tasks to control for some of the non-episodic processes involved. And here's one of the first results that we reported, where you can see, if you look at brain activity during remembering actual past events and brain activity during imagining future events, there's a lot of overlap in the activity. These two big swaths of activity back here in the what's known as the retrosplenial cortex and parietal cortex, up here in the frontal lobe, right along the midline, they're almost indistinguishable when you remember the past and imagine the future. And in fact, there are a bunch of areas. All the regions in that core network that I talked about come online very similarly when you remember the past and imagine the future. We're not going to have time to go through each region and talk about what each region might be doing, but I've just listed a few suggestions based on other research for what these regions are doing in common when you remember the past and imagine the future. Just harking back briefly to the debate this morning, this is the region that I mentioned that comes online during remembering the past and reimagining the future, and also in other experiments when you think about yourself. It also comes online when you think about God. That was what I mentioned earlier. It's that region in the medial prefrontal cortex. So there's striking commonalities, but there are also some interesting differences. For example, we found conditions under which the hippocampus, which most of us in the memory field think of as the key structure for memory, actually showed more activation when you're imagining future events than when you're remembering past events. And that's something we find really interesting. What is it about the imaginative activity of projecting yourself into the future that actually gets the hippocampus more activated than remembering an actual event from the past. That's an exciting question for people like me who are interested in memory in the brain. It's one that we're pursuing, and we think that these kinds of observations that I've told you about lead us to suggest that one of the origins of the future, the title of this conference, lies in memory. Thanks for your attention.
Gracias.